online kennissessie van Fondsnieuws en Investment Officer. Een wereld zonder fossiel, daar gaan we het over hebben vanmiddag. Nou ja, jullie kennen de cijfers. 65% van alle CO2-uitstoot wordt veroorzaakt door het verbranden van zaken als gas, olie en steenkool. De wrange ironie is dat dezelfde grondstoffen die ons welvaart hebben gebracht nu de aarde bedreigen. Het laatste IPCC-rapport, voor iedereen die nog twijfelde, is nog duidelijker dan ooit. We moeten helemaal af van fossiel. Maar ondertussen zijn we er nog steeds een beetje aan verslaafd en proberen we af te kicken. Onze sprekers van vandaag, Tom Walker van Schröder en Ramon Estrellas van BNP Paribas, die zeggen dat het investeren in slimme oplossingen een bijdrage kan leveren aan dat afkicken en aan het komen tot een wereld zonder fossiel. Welcome to your boat, gentlemen. We'll be talking soon. Want eerst ga ik hier in de studio naar Hans van Kleef naast mij. Jij bent de senior energie-econoom van ABN AMRO. Als econoom buig je je over van, wat hebben we nu? Hoe zit de economie nu in elkaar? En waar moeten we dan naartoe? Naar die fossielvrije wereld. We hebben net COP26 afgesloten. Gaat het ons lukken? Ben je hoopvol?
Ja, ik ben toch wel hoopvol. Ik zag heel veel pessimistische verhalen, maar eigenlijk zag ik toch ook wel positieve ontwikkelingen. En zeker als je vergelijkt waar we waren in het Parijsakkoord en ten opzichte van de afspraken die er nu zijn gemaakt, zijn er echt alweer serieuze stappen gezet. Dus ik ben wel degelijk hoopvol.
Oké, je hebt een presentatie voorbereid om te kijken hoe we die transitie dan door kunnen komen. Dus de floor is yours. Ga je gang.
Dank u wel. Ja, in mijn verhaal zou ik eigenlijk uiteen willen zetten de moeilijkheid die we op dit moment, waar we op dit moment mee te maken hebben. En zoals net al aangegeven werd, ik kijk naar de grondstoffenmarkt, de huidige ontwikkelingen. Maar ik kijk ook naar de lange termijn trends. En dat is precies waar af en toe de schoen wringt. Nou, ons energiebeleid is eigenlijk altijd gestoeld geweest op 3 pilaren. De eerste is duurzaamheid, we hebben betaalbaarheid en leveringszekerheid. En dat af en toe, het mooiste zou zijn als dat in balans is. Maar eerlijk gezegd is dat de laatste tijd wat minder het geval. En dat wil ik eigenlijk laten zien door dit plaatje. En normaal gesproken bouw ik het plaatje rustig op, maar dat ging helaas niet. Dus u krijgt alles in één keer. Bovenin zien we de klimaatdoelen. En we hebben het natuurlijk gezien onlangs dat op COP26 Biden riep voor meer actie. We hebben de Timmermans gezien met zijn Fit for 55. Het IPCC-rapport waar net aan verwezen wordt. Oftewel het besef dat we meer moeten doen en sneller moeten gaan, is er wel degelijk. Tegelijkertijd, linksonder zien we de economie. We zien dat Biden, nadat hij van het podium afstapt om te zeggen van we moeten meer doen aan het klimaat, belt met OPEC om te zeggen van kunnen we niet iets meer olieproductie, want die benzineprijs in de VS is wel heel erg hoog. We hebben natuurlijk hier in Europa de gasprijzen die het dak uitschieten vanwege tekorten. Daar kom ik zo dadelijk nog even op terug. We hebben Boris Johnson in het VK die eigenlijk die COP georganiseerd heeft en zei van we moeten sneller en meer. Maar tegelijkertijd heeft hij zijn verbod op cv-ketels weer teruggedraaid, want de prijs werd wel erg hoog voor de consument. En tegelijkertijd zien we rechtsonder het leveringszekerheid, de security of supply issue. En dat is ook iets wat steeds meer in het geding komt. En zeker hier in Nederland. We hebben natuurlijk jarenlang kunnen putten op het Groningen gasveld. En nu zien we toch dat nu we die productie aanzienlijk hebben teruggebracht en dus importafhankelijk zijn geworden, dat problemen met zich meeneemt. Hè? Dus we worden meer afhankelijk van Rusland, maar dat geldt niet alleen voor gas, dat geldt overigens ook voor alle andere brandstoffen en met name dan fossiele brandstoffen. Dus dit geeft eigenlijk een beetje aan in een notendop van wat zijn de 3 drijfveren en waar wringt die schoen. Nou, als we kijken van waar moeten we naartoe, dan kijken we eigenlijk vooral naar langetermijn scenario's. En die kennen we van het Internationaal Energieagentschap, die keurig ieder jaar in de World Energy Outlook uiteenzet van wat zijn de verschillende scenario's om te komen tot een net zero situatie, net zero CO2-uitstoot in 2050. Wat wij bij de banken doen, is wij kijken vaak naar het NGFS, oftewel het Network for Greening the Financial System. Dat is het systeem wat gebruikt wordt door de ECB en door de Nederlandse bank. En dat is ook waar wij dan als bank mee werken. En waarom is het nou zo belangrijk om naar die verschillende scenario's te kijken? Nou, dus vanwege een aantal redenen. En de eerste is om risico's in te schatten. Dat is eigenlijk de belangrijkste reden. We zien hier in dit plaatje, en het is een beetje druk, maar aan de rechterkant ziet u 6 verschillende scenario's. Waarbij de bovenste is current policies. En ook dat kennen we uit de World Energy Outlook, maar dat hebben we hier dus ook. En op het moment dat je dus eigenlijk met het huidige beleid verder niets zou doen en we gaan doormodderen, zou ik maar zeggen, zoals we dat nu doen, dan lopen we tegen fysieke risico's aan. Hè? Want dan is die temperatuurstijging het hoogst. En dus dat is goed om in beeld te brengen. Tegelijkertijd zien we aan die scenario's aan de onderkant het net zero 2050, het scenario, waarbij we dus eigenlijk heel snel actie moeten ondernemen. Daar zien we dus een hele snelle daling van die CO2-uitstoot. En dat brengt juist weer transitierisico's met zich mee. Dat is vaak getriggerd door overheidsbeleid. Nou, deze scenario's die houden we dus in kaart, die monitoren we. En op basis daarvan gaan we kijken van in hoeverre moet het klimaat aangescherpt, of het beleid aangescherpt worden, om te komen uiteindelijk tot die netto zero situatie in 2050. Ook ziet u een gehighlighte lijn, lekker Nederland, een gele lijn waarbij eigenlijk 3 verschillende scenario's samenkomen. En dat is een beetje het scenario dat wij als afdeling zien, van wat het meest waarschijnlijk is. En ja, wellicht valt het wat tegen, maar in het begin denken wij dat we met name nog met het National Determined Contributions, oftewel wat is toegezegd, dat we daarin blijven hangen. En dat duurt tot zeker 2030. En op zich is dat ook niet zo raar, want als we bedenken dat het huidige beleid, ja, als je dat nu inzet, dan moet een windpark bijvoorbeeld, ja, het bouwen ervan kost 7 jaar. Dus als we dat nu op gang zetten, en dan moet het vergunningentraject nog mee zitten ook. Maar als we dat nu in gang zetten, dan staat dat er rond 2030. Dus op een hele korte termijn zal die versnelling er wel zijn, maar niet zozeer zichtbaar. Daarna gaat het accelereren. Dat is ook die gele lijn die we daarna zien. Om vervolgens weer een beetje langzamer uit te faseren, zeg maar. Omdat landen als China en Azië en zeker ook in Afrika, ja, die zitten gewoon in een hele andere fase van die energietransitie en zullen dat wat lastiger hebben. Dus dat is waarom we naar dit soort lange termijn scenario's kijken. Dus dat is zeg maar waar we heen moeten. Tegelijkertijd zien we verschillende schokken op korte termijn. En ik heb hier een paar drijfveren neergezet, een paar verschillende soorten grondstoffen. Dus we hebben gas, kolen, we hebben de CO2-markt, we hebben duurzame energie, het percentage dat natuurlijk steeds verder groeit. En dan hebben we oliemarkt. En we zien een aantal pijltjes naar de elektriciteitsmarkt, de elektriciteitsprijs. En daar komt dat samen. Olie die staat daar dan niet direct, omdat het geen directe link heeft, gelukkig zou ik haast zeggen, met de elektriciteitsmarkt. Maar ook dat is een belangrijke grondstof voor de huidige economie en voor ons als beleggers. Als ik ze heel kort even langsloop, dan zien we gasprijzen. Nou, we kennen allemaal het verhaal op dit moment dat er te weinig gasvoorraden zijn in Europa en zeker in Nederland. Rusland die moeite heeft of wat te terughoudend is om de gasexport te verhogen richting Europa. Heel verhaal geopolitiek rondom de Nord Stream 2. En dat zorgt dat die gasprijzen heel erg hoog zijn. Tegelijkertijd zien we dat ook de kolenprijs heel erg hoog is. En dat komt vanwege het feit dat de Chinezen hebben gezegd dat ze geen kolen willen importeren uit Australië. Australië vond wat van A, het COVID-gebeuren en B, van het Oeigoerenbeleid van China. En daardoor heeft China gezegd van oké, geen kolen uit Australië. Maar dat geeft dus extra druk mee op de kolenmarkt uit de rest van de wereld. Nou, we hebben in Europa het beleid rondom CO2-rechten. We zien die prijs vandaag een nieuw record bereiken. Doordat er krapte op de markt ontstaat. Meer vraag naar fossiele brandstoffen, dus meer vraag naar CO2-rechten. Die prijs gaat omhoog. En dat steunt uiteindelijk ons wel richting in de goede richting voor klimaatbeleid. Maar tegelijkertijd zien we natuurlijk wel dat dat effect heeft op elektriciteitsprijzen. En ook op een dag als vandaag zien we dat de opbrengst van duurzame energie redelijk beperkt is. Het waait vandaag niet, het is een beetje een lullige dag, zon schijnt niet, een beetje grijzig. Oftewel, we draaien in ieder geval hier in Nederland, maar dat geldt natuurlijk overal, heel erg op onze fossiele brandstoffen. Dus de gascentrales en de kolencentrales, die draaien op dit moment overuren. Tot slot hebben we nog de oliemarkt. En de olie en OPEC, nou ja, we hebben net al een beetje gezegd, die vraag-aanbod-verhouding is niet helemaal in balans. We zien dat de vraag harder is aangetrokken dan het aanbod nadat we die enorme prijsstijging hebben gezien door COVID. En we verwachten eigenlijk dat dat nog wel heel eventjes aanhoudt. En daar zit een disbalans. Aan de ene kant horen we Biden zeggen van er moet meer productie bij. En tegelijkertijd is OPEC juist heel terughoudend omdat ze zeggen ja, de vraag gaat afvlakken begin volgend jaar. Oftewel heel veel spanning op alle facetten van de energiemarkt. En dat zorgt dus voor die bewegingen in de elektriciteitsprijs en op de markt. Maar dat houdt in ieder geval ons als burgers, als beleggers, maar zeker ook de politici bezig met het hier en nu. Nou, zodat we dan even kijken van wat doet dat dan voor de prijzen. Nou, ik zei al, alles gaat omhoog. Dat geldt voor gas, dat geldt voor die CO2-rechten. We zien het in de kolenprijs. En dus vertaalt zich dat ook door in een hogere elektriciteitsprijs. En dat is waarom de politici ons een extra vergoeding hebben gegeven om die elektriciteitsprijs een beetje te dempen en huishoudens wat lucht te geven. Maar we zien ook tegelijkertijd dat dit nog wel is waar onze economie op draait. En daarnaast moeten we dus enorme investeringen doen in duurzame energie. om de afhankelijkheid van fossiele brandstoffen af te bouwen en dus zeg maar de hele nieuwe energiemix op te bouwen. We moeten niet vergeten dat de huidige energiemix opgebouwd is in 40, 50, soms wel 60 jaar. En we verwachten nu eigenlijk sinds Parijs dat we in no time die hele energiemix ombouwen naar een CO2-neutrale energiemix. En dat kost gewoon tijd. Nou, als ik dat dan samenvat in, wat betekent dat dan? Dan hebben we onderin weer die 3 doelen, of die 3 pijlers, hè, de klimaat, economie en de leveringszekerheid. En dat is echt een balancing act, een fragiel iets, dat als we te veel focussen op één van die 3 pijlers, dan zie je die balans een beetje wegzakken. En dat is natuurlijk ook wat de laatste paar jaar is gebeurd. Heel veel aandacht voor duurzaam, iets minder voor leveringszekerheid en voor de economie. En het gevolg is dat we nu hele hoge prijzen hebben. Nou, niet alleen dat, maar dat heeft er wel degelijk aan bijgedragen. Wat moeten we nu doen? Nou, in ieder geval de investeringen in duurzaam. En daar is denk ik iedereen het over eens. Die moeten minimaal verdrievoudigen, dat is ook wat het Internationaal Energieagentschap zegt. Minimaal verdrievoudigen om op het pad te blijven richting een CO2-neutrale omgeving in 2050. De wetgeving moet daarvoor klaargemaakt worden. We hebben nieuwe technologie nodig, dus er moet behoorlijk in geïnvesteerd worden om die ontwikkeling door te zetten. Want we kunnen met de huidige technologie een aardige stap zetten, maar dat is niet voldoende om te komen tot de uiteindelijke oplossing. Opkomende markten, dat is denk ik een van de belangrijkste winsten in Glasgow van de afgelopen week. Opkomende markten moeten echt geholpen worden, financieel, maar ook in de technologie, om te komen tot die CO2-neutrale omgeving. En ik heb er staan 3 transities. En dat is dat we niet eigenlijk alleen maar de aanbodkant moeten bekijken, dus de leveranciers van de grondstoffen, maar het moet ook geregeld worden vanuit de vraagkant en vanuit de economische kant. Ook die 3 moeten in balans zijn, wil je tot een gezonde transitie komen. Is er dan positief nieuws? Ja, dat is er zeker. We zien een enorme toename van duurzame energie. We zien als gevolg daar ook van dat de kosten heel erg omlaag komen. Dus wind- en zonne-energie zijn serieus veel goedkoper dan dat 10 jaar terug was. En als we dan nog even terugpakken op Glasgow, dan zien we vooral ook dat op dit moment alle pledges, alle targets, die zijn gericht op 2,1 graden. Dat is te hoog. Maar in Parijs gingen we nog uit van 3,6. Dus er is al een enorme stap gezet naar waar we nu zijn. Er moet nog veel meer bij en dat moet ook gerealiseerd worden. Maar het momentum is er en de richting is er. Maar ik denk dat het allerbelangrijkste is, het is een transitie, het is geen transformatie. En daarom terugkomend op de vraag van eigenlijk deze kennissessie, kunnen we zonder fossiele brandstoffen? Ik denk dat kunnen we, maar nu nog even niet.
Ja, dankjewel. Aan de mensen thuis, jullie kunnen vragen indienen. Dan stel ik ze hier aan Hans van Kleef. Dus typ die in op je scherm en dan komen ze bij mij binnen. Ik ga even helemaal terug naar het begin. Hè, die slide met al die lijntjes. Ja. Waarbij je zegt, als we niks doen, dan blijven we daarboven. Dat zijn fysieke risico's. Nou, dat is overstromingen en het weer, noem maar op. En het andere lijntje zeg je, dat is transitierisico. Maar wat bedoel je daar dan precies mee?
Dat als je een bedrijf hebt die bijvoorbeeld nu werkt met fossiele brandstoffen, als daar een overheidsbesluit komt, vooral eigenlijk komt het vanuit die kant, die zegt van je mag bepaalde grondstoffen niet meer gebruiken, of je mag niet meer doen wat je doet, dan loop je een bedrijfsrisico. Dus dan wordt er door een externe factor, zeg maar, ingegrepen op jouw businessmodel.
Doordat we via de politiek en met z'n allen en democratische besluitvorming gaan we beslissingen nemen. En die zijn in zichzelf dus ook risicovol.
Als het te snel gaat wel. En dat zie je bijvoorbeeld terugkomen in de CO2-prijs. Dat er nu landen zijn die zeggen van een hoge CO2-prijs, dat is prima. Dat verwelkomen we. Want dat zorgt voor een prikkel om te komen naar een duurzame omgeving. Maar als die prijsstijging te snel gaat, dat betekent dat bedrijven alleen maar bezig zijn met die emissierechten te kopen en dus weinig geld meer over hebben om te investeren in nieuwe technologie bijvoorbeeld. Ja. Dus de prikkel is goed, maar je moet ook niet iets kapot slaan.
Oké, kapitaalvernietiging heb je het dan uiteindelijk ook gewoon
eigenlijk over, wel, ja.
Je ging ook even in op de energiemix. Dat is natuurlijk een hele interessante. We hebben van alles op tafel liggen. Daarvan zei je dat is niet genoeg. Hè. Zon en wind zal door moeten ontwikkelen. Zie jij een rol voor kernenergie? Vooral de nieuwe type?
Ja, zeker. Ook als je kijkt naar wat...
Ik zeg hem een beetje verkeerd. Kernenergie is er natuurlijk al. Maar denk je dat daar gas op gegeven zal moeten gaan worden? Hebben we dat nodig?
Ja, dat denk ik wel. Als je kijkt naar, en dat is ook wat de Internationaal Energieagentschap zegt, eigenlijk hebben we alles nodig. Wil je serieus werk maken van het klimaatbeleid en komen naar een CO2-neutrale omgeving, dan moet je ook niet per se inzetten op groene energie. Je moet inzetten op CO2-neutraal. En ja, je kan van alles vinden van kernenergie, maar het is CO2-neutraal, dat is een gegeven.
Maar hebben we dan genoeg al in de huidige mix? Want het is allemaal doorontwikkelen of zijn we stiekem nog op zoek naar een nieuwe... waterstof is natuurlijk ook...
Waterstof is een oplossing. Je hebt elektronen en moleculen, je hebt ze allebei nodig. Waterstof zou een optie kunnen zijn om in ieder geval aan de moleculenkant de dingen draaiende te kunnen houden. Ja. Maar goed, ook daar zitten we in een transitie. En de enige waterstof die we nu kennen is grijs, gemaakt uit aardgas. De stap naar blauw om dus aardgas te gebruiken om het te produceren, maar dan de CO2-uitstoot op te vangen, dat vinden we eigenlijk niet fijn. We willen meteen naar groen. Ja. Maar we zijn ook nog bezig met de huidige elektriciteitsmix te verduurzamen. Dus dat alles tegelijk opbouwen, dat kan, dat gebeurt, maar dat kost tijd. En
geld? Hoe zie je dat in landen die nog in ontwikkeling zijn? Hè? Dat was op CO2 op COP26 een belangrijk onderdeel. Ja. Je zei ook, daar is nu meer erkenning voor dat die Zeker. Nog meer, vorige keer was al 100 miljard geloof ik toegezegd.
Ja, maar daar kwamen we niet toe. En nu is het weer toegezegd, die 100 miljard.
Kunnen die dat soort hele dure transitie... Want zon en wind is voor heel veel landen nog te duur, om nog maar te zwijgen over kernenergie.
Ja, nee, natuurlijk. Maar uiteindelijk moet je het met z'n allen doen. Het klimaatprobleem is niet een Nederlands probleem. Het klimaat houdt niet op bij de grens. Dus je moet het met z'n allen doen. En er komt steeds meer geld beschikbaar om die stappen te zetten, om die transitie te maken. En ik denk dat je zeker, en dat misschien ook wel nog een belangrijkere rol is voor landen als Nederland, om natuurlijk onze eigen energiemix te verduurzamen, maar zeker ook om bij te dragen aan de verduurzaming elders. En dat was ook een van de mooie dingen uit COP, denk ik, dat er een soort handelsafspraak is gemaakt, waarbij je dus ook CO2-uitstoot kan verhandelen op beperking daarvan eigenlijk. Dus, en daar zie ik echt wel een rol voor Europa.
Okay, dankjewel. Hans van Kleef, energie-econoom van ABN AMRO.
Dankjewel.
Ja, we gaan naar onze... No, I'm switching to English now because we're going to our first guest. The energy transition is perhaps, we could say, the most existential topic of today, but it's also a major investment opportunity. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, it requires $150 trillion. So that's 12 zeros in investments to create this fossil-free economy. Investments that should partly come from the private sector, so from private capital. Ramon Estrellas is a senior investment analysis specialist within the Environmental Strategies Group at BNP Paribas AM. He has a great understanding of the dynamics in the global energy sector, and he believes this is the time to invest. I'll talk to him about world energy politics and the way to invest in a green future. Welcome, Ramon.
Thank you, Esther.
Warm welcome. In an interview on Fonds News, you said that in contrast to previous transitions from one energy resource to another, there's a huge economic incentive this time. How's that? What's the case?
Well, the thing is, if we look at for example, what some economists say, there's one who is in Canada now of Czech origin called Václav Smil. He wrote a book about energy transitions. We've been actually experiencing several energy transitions since 1840. First it was coal, and it took around 60 years to become the predominant source of energy. Then it was oil and gas, and again it took more than 10 or 20 years to become predominant. And now we have renewables. And we think it is different because it is for the first time a transition towards from a non-renewable source to a renewable source, and the efforts have to be really global, because what we have been doing as Homo sapiens during our industrialization after the second half of the 19th century, we have actually emitted a large amount of greenhouse gases that is increasing global temperature to unseen levels in the last 2,000 years. So we think it is different because it is more global and because the risks are much higher than in previous energy transitions.
Okay, so it's more global, higher risks, but I kind of feel that there's also another difference. Before, for example, when we made a transition to gas, there was also a big economic gain. We could be more efficient in heating our houses or in cooking our meals. But this time, the efficiency is, well, the other way around.
Actually, technology is improving a lot. in order for us to use renewable sources of energy that can be very efficient as some other fossil fuels that we are burning to produce energy, and at a lower cost. So there are many, many advantages also through technology of the use of renewable energy and other measures to be much more prudent in the use of energy. I think you can already see, even though some of these companies are fairly young and have developed maybe seriously in the renewable space since the mid 2000s approximately, many of them are profitable and many of them are showing us the advantages of producing energy without having that negative effect on the atmosphere. So I would tend to disagree with you, Esther, in the sense that there are already technologies that can be very efficient and that can, from which we can benefit actually. Most of all, because even if there is a 10% risk that global temperature goes up at the end of the century above 2 degrees Celsius with respect to pre-industrial level, the stakes at hand and the effects at hand are so big, we just cannot hide from this phenomenon.
That is quite clear, but I hear you say also that apart from the benefits that we really need it for, which are the planet and the climate, of course, you say there's also benefits in terms of efficiency in the long run, in terms of efficiency and costs for us. Okay, that's good news. Let's briefly look back at COP26. There was no universal commitment agreement reached on the use of oil and gas and coal. Isn't that strange, given that 62% of the emissions stem from that?
Actually, wishfully thinking, it is, of course, because if you look at the energy produced here on this planet, over, I think the last estimates are 80% come from fossil fuels. So this is oil, gas, this is coal, etc. Now, the issue with all the challenges around climate change is that you really need to coordinate globally in countries that are developing at a different rate. Some countries are starting to develop now and thus will push energy demand up. Other countries, for example, are already developed and have industrialized and can actually pull back on the consumption of fossil fuels. I think it's a very complex issue. I think the most important conclusions out of COP26, in our opinion, again, humbly, of course, are that one, the first decisions they took actually were around deforestation. We'll stop deforestation by 2030. You know that land and forestry are big, they capture the reservoirs of carbon. So it's very important that we keep them alive. They also, it's interesting because they also have decided that actually before I make a decision, I will take into account the level of emissions of greenhouse gases. This is very important. But apart from that, I think a large part of scientists are not happy with the measures. They don't think it has been said or agreed enough. Greenhouse gas emissions, the idea is to revise the objectives next year. The funding of or the help that developing countries might need, you know, they've asked for about $1.3 trillion, which makes a lot of sense to adapt to all the problems around climate change. Now think that GDP is around $85 trillion annually, so the amount of money that is needed is very large. We have still not agreed on how to channel that. Fossil fuels, phasing out of fossil fuels, of course, and avoiding inefficient subsidies from some of these fossil fuels. But they're all pledges, it's not real direct measures. And last but not least, how do we trade carbon? Because this is going to help us, of course, to put a price on carbon emitted by fossil fuels. So we think actually it was necessary to have this sort of conference, and it will have to be necessary going forwards. It's a very complex issue, a very coordinated global issue, and at least there are some pledges that are interesting that will have to be reinforced with time.
Okay, so this is what all the politicians had to do and have to do for us, and they've been trying and making an effort. Now let's go to the investors, because you say you guys as investors can play a role. Now, we have the very big Dutch pension fund, ABP, in the Netherlands. And for a long time, they were trying to influence the whole transition by engagement, but now they decided to stop with fossil. Is that the way to go about?
Okay, this is a very interesting question. Of course, the most aggressive way to engage is to vote with your feet, right? It's to simply avoid financing fossil fuels. It is also true that when you look at the propositions, when you engage with a company, you might do it several ways. You can do it by voting in the General Assembly of Shareholders, and voting against or in favor of a certain number of propositions. Now, the issue is that the majority, when you look at the real numbers, the majority of propositions are around the board, remuneration, new members of that board, et cetera, et cetera. So there's not many issues, and in that sense, ABP as a point, there are not many proposals in the annual Assembly of Shareholders linked, for example, to, okay, let's reduce the level of greenhouse gas emissions, or let's reduce the usage of water, for example, in our operations. So in a way, they are, I think, in our opinion, it is a very efficient way, let's put it this way, to actually, put some coherence in your investment decisions. But we think that engagement, in our opinion, can be done also through voting, of course, the same way that we can engage as citizens, voting for certain politicians that might take this issues more seriously. We also think that engagement is actually having conversations with clients. You can, in a very efficient way, speak to a client who is not using a lot of renewables and maybe put them in touch with a company that's offering renewables, and thus just matching the needs of that specific client with one supplier that you also speak to or where you might invest. So interesting effort. We think it is a coherent way, of course, to do engagement, but we also think there are other ways in which it can be done efficiently too.
Okay, thank you. We will get back to that later in the poll questions. Another thing is the energy mix. Hans already mentioned it. The future, well, sun and wind obviously have to play a big role. Nuclear has been mentioned, but how do you see it? How is the future energy mix going to be, and will there be surprises?
Okay, that's also a very interesting question. If you mentioned IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, and actually they publish a very interesting report. We highly recommend the Global Renewables Outlook, which is published on a yearly basis. And when you look at that report, they actually tell you that the renewable share of electricity, for example, was in 2018 around 26%. If we continue to burn fossil fuels the way we are doing now, we could arrive by 2050 at around 55% of renewables share of electricity. But if we want to achieve those objectives of reducing aggressively the level of greenhouse gas emissions that come from burning fossil fuels, we would need renewables to be a much, much larger share of electricity, around 86% in the next 30 years, if we really want to achieve this decarbonizing of the energy system. And I think there could be surprises. China, France, where I am now, have made decisions to invest in nuclear, for example, to try to make it much more efficient in terms of the usage of water, in terms of security, in terms of the treatment of waste, for example. And instead of building huge nuclear plants, which take many, many years to build, maybe focus on more smaller solutions that can help you decarbonize this system, because, among other things, this is one of the most energy dense or one of the sources that has the higher energy density and that can be stored quite easily. So could they be surprises? Absolutely yes. It depends on the technology, but I think now that there is, we explained before, there's a lot of money invested in R&D to try to find a much more efficient solution and help us decarbonize the system.
That's the thing with innovation. We don't know. We know there'll be surprises. We don't know where they will be. You say that I think you said that over 50%, if I'm correct, of the companies in BNP's portfolio of the energy transition strategy, your portfolio, they show between 70 and 80% of their revenues are linked to the energy transition. How do you measure that? Where does that come from?
Okay. This is just the way we do it, but it's been working fairly well now for some years. What we try to do is we try to look for impact very, very early in the investment process. What does that mean? This means that you look at a company, we're just focusing on environmental solutions. So if you look at a company's revenues or CapEx, we prefer CapEx because they're looking into the future, or EBITDA that is linked to the sale of a product or a service that's offering a solution to help us, for example, decarbonize the system. If you invest in a provider of wind turbines for the wind industry, and over 50% of your revenues is linked to the sale of those wind turbines, we think it has thematic purity. We're looking already for impact very early in the investment process. This is one way to actually link the revenues, CapEx, or EBITDA of your companies with an environmental solution. And this is what, as you said, over 50% can show us that they have a lot of thematic purity, that they're actually linking their numbers to an environmental solution. The rest of the companies have also very high numbers linked to environmental solution, but maybe are less high than over 50% of the companies we have in the portfolio.
And are you pushing them by engagement to make sure it goes up?
Well, that's a great question, because we've spoken about engagement before. We've been speaking to companies, for example, and I gave that example. It's a real example with a company that's in the fishing industry, if we might call it like that. And actually, we tried to convince them to increase their use of renewables. They have fish farms, right? And this works because, first of all, if you engage with a company and explain that, look, your competition is doing this, it's not going to have a negative effect on your cost base because of these reasons, and you're emitting less greenhouse gases, so you're having a positive impact on the environment. Definitely engaging for us is also having conversations with companies to try to promote the use of renewable energies. Absolutely, yes. Okay,
so that sounds like you're helping them to find a proper business model for the transition, basically. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Ramon Estrellas. You're staying with us. We're going to listen to our next guest, and we'll be back with you later in the program. So the United Nations estimate that 68% of the world population will live in urban areas by 2050. This will create a vacuum for economic activity. It will drive demand for energy, and it will create a sustainable scarcity in real estate. An attractive combination for investors, at least. That is what our next guest says. It's Tom Walker. He's the co-head of global listed real estate assets at Schroders. Tom said there's another reason investors should pay close attention to cities, next to the ones I just mentioned. Urban areas are responsible for 70% of fossil fuel related to CO2 emissions. That is according to the International Energy Agency. That puts cities at the heart of the energy transition. In Tom's words, an energy transition without major cities isn't possible. Welcome, Tom Walker.
Hi, Esther. Thanks very much for having me.
Hi, how are you today? Well, apart from the population concentration, why is it that urban areas can actually play a key role in the energy transition?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I think, firstly, it is almost impossible to divorce the efficiencies that are created by cities by removing the population concentration. I mean, that is why they are such efficient organisms, if you can call them that. But just stepping away, as your question says, from the population concentration, I think for us, what we often see with cities is actually many of the policies that certain cities around the world have are actually far more ambitious than maybe the national or regional policies in that particular geography. And I think that's very encouraging for us. And as an example, if you look at a city like New York, by 2030, they want to reduce their carbon emissions by 40%. The city itself is investing in 2 new electricity transmission lines, all with a purpose of bringing in more renewable power into that city. So you can see that that city is far more ambitious at this point in time with regard to some of the national policies that have been coming through. So we really look at things like public transport, renewable power as being real solutions to helping cities lead the way with regard to this move to net zero carbon.
Okay, so you're saying New York is very ambitious. Do you have like a top 3 of the most ambitious cities in the world?
Yeah, we do. It's really hard to actually compare a city in one part of the world with another, because some cities are very transparent and disclose lots of information, and others it's harder to get the information that we're looking for in terms of complete clarity of policies. And obviously some cities just don't have the policies that developed at this point in time. What we did actually launch earlier on this year was our first European Sustainable Cities Index, looking at things like a city's policy with regard to single-use plastics, renewable power, clean public transport as examples. And actually the city that came top was on Amsterdam, with London and Paris coming in at number 2 and 3. But certainly I think Amsterdam deserves a special mention. And then a city that we always think very highly of, that's been sort of, had climate policies since the 70s, would be Stockholm. So there is kind of a strong European flavor to those sustainable cities.
Calling in from Amsterdam, so I should ask you another question about it. What is so good about Amsterdam? Is it because maybe we are already quite sustainable, or are we making quick transitions?
Yeah, it's a combination of everything, as you say. First of all, you've got policies on those points that I mentioned earlier, like single-use plastics, more renewable power, and then you've got very clear targets that you want to hit by 2030, 2040. And I think it's that transparency which gives investors like us complete confidence that if we allocate capital to, in my particular sector, in real estate in Amsterdam, we know that we're going to continue to have, very strong environmental focus with that allocation, in contrast to another city perhaps where policies aren't quite so developed.
Okay, so the urbanization that we just mentioned, 68% is in the end will be the urbanization grade, I could say. It is expecting to grow mainly in developing economies, or is the urbanization in developing economies also?
Yeah, it's really across the world. Absolutely, you can see faster absolute urbanization in developing countries. Cities like Lagos is one that in our database shows up really, really attractively in terms of the level of urbanization. But then you can continue to see it in developed economies. Places like Tokyo, Sydney, London still are urbanizing. And one of the great things about cities is that the larger they become, the more efficient they become. The agglomeration benefits just continue to grow. So they're actually a very rare organism that gets more efficient the larger they are, unlike someone like me that definitely becomes more inefficient the larger I become. So that's perhaps a separate subject. But we certainly think that you can still allocate capital to both developed and developing cities and still get that very resilient income stream that will grow over and above inflation.
Okay. There are 4 main sources I've read of pollution in cities. It's waste, transport, infrastructure, and real estate. I saw this in the IEA report we just mentioned. Real estate is also responsible for 62% of the CO2 emissions in cities. And I think that's your focus, isn't it, real estate? So yeah. Can we build and live without emissions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, real estate has a massive problem with regard to the carbon that it emits. And, we're all living somewhere, we're working somewhere, all of that real estate has to be made more efficient. And as you mentioned at the beginning, if we don't do that, we're simply not going to meet the new climate targets that we have. So it's an absolute imperative that our sector continues to lead the way with regard to sustainable development and operation of buildings. And so for me, there are two key ingredients that we need to think about here. Firstly, and this is very easy with new developments, that we can develop a new building and we can have a net zero carbon building. That's quite easy to achieve with today's technology. What is harder and more expensive is actually retrofitting existing buildings. There is a large capital expenditure bill coming the way for many landlords, and we have to ensure that they get access to loans to be able to facilitate that transition. But there's also one other vital ingredient to this conversation, which we think about very carefully with regard to developments, because there is a huge amount of embodied carbon in steel and in concrete and glass to make a new building. So it's actually no longer sort of good enough just to have a net zero carbon operational building. You've got to think about that embodied carbon that you are, incurring, if you like, as you create those materials to build a new building. And I think that is often overlooked by the sector, and it's something that we focus on a lot. So actually there's a lot to be said for retrofitting the existing buildings rather than developing new buildings. But certainly in our sector, we see some real leaders, some very innovative policies, very ambitious policies. I actually just got an email this morning from one of our companies in Australia, and they believe they've become the first real estate company to become energy net positive. And they were actually targeting to do that previously by 2030. And so that's really quite an achievement and shows you the ambition of some of the guys that we're speaking to.
Let me check if I get your retrofitting, if I get that right. So you're talking about reusing old materials. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah,
or is it
more talking about refurbishing existing buildings. And so you've got a standing asset today, and we say retrofitting in terms of putting in double glazing, maybe changing the gas boiler to an electric boiler. That is, retrofitting an existing building so that you're ensuring that it is fit for purpose today and will comply with legislation that is, driving us towards net zero carbon.
Okay, that's clear then. Well, I can imagine that cities are not investable in a way that stocks are. How do you make a city investable?
Yeah, well, we don't make the city investable, but, we analyze the city. We're using a huge amount of data in our investment process, and we've really distilled it down to 4 databases that we've built. We look at transport connectivity, we look at environmental risk, we look at levels of innovation, and then overall economic growth. And if we can find cities with those 4 ingredients that are all growing and all in the right direction, then we think it is a sustainable city that we believe we want to allocate capital to, as opposed to cities which we think may not be economically sustainable, and therefore their economies are not going to grow.
You were going so fast. What were the 4 components? Innovation, growth?
Sorry, I must speak slower. It's this, the passion of talking about real estate. So we've got a transport connectivity database, an environmental database, an innovation database, and then an economic database. And all of those databases are effectively calculating for us where the most attractive cities are in the world, and then which companies have exposure to those cities that we believe we can then benefit from.
So give me an example. You're looking for a company that has an exposure to a city. In what way? Can you give us an example?
Yeah, so first of all, we're looking at the city and we're saying, is it a city that is environmentally resilient? Is it a city that has transport connections, which will mean it's easy to move people and goods around that city? Are there high levels of innovation, which will lead to new businesses being formed and then talented graduates, if you like, coming into the workforce? And then is the overall economy strong? If we can find a city, and let's, as an example, use Boston, it's one of the, it's the leading kind of biotech capital of the world. You've got Harvard and MIT in that city. If we can find a city like Boston, which our databases identify as being attractive, we will then look for companies that have high levels of exposure to that city, so that we can then get exposure to Boston. And so we will then start to scrape company websites, again, using data to ensure that all of the rent collected by particular companies is coming from Boston, as opposed to other cities we do not want exposure to, in which case we would discard a company. So again, it's about, it's one of the things that Ramon mentioned earlier. I wrote it down. It was about sort of thematic purity, he mentioned. And that's exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for companies that can give us pure exposure to a particular city, and data is at the heart of us being able to establish that.
Tom, the thing I can't get my head around just yet is like the companies you choose, and they're exposed to these cities, but they don't have to be involved in specific activities. It could be anything, or what kind of companies?
Yeah, so we're looking for real assets in those particular cities, and we think that whether it's a self-storage unit, whether it's a life science asset, whether it's a healthcare asset, or even an office building, we believe that if it is in a sustainable city, you will see more demand for that asset than if it was located in another area. And we're looking for a resilient income stream that grows.
But a coal factory in a very high potential city, you wouldn't invest in that, would you?
It depends. What we like to look for is assets which are very hard to build. So you have scarcity. We don't want to invest into commoditized assets, many of which, offices and retail we would categorize as commoditized. We want assets like data centers or hospitals, which are actually very hard to build, take a long time. And that gives us scarcity, which gives us pricing power, which is very important, particularly if we're going to head into an inflationary environment.
So I was trying to get a clear idea of the difference between a normal real estate strategy and yours. Do you think we have it now?
Yeah, I think that I would highlight our use of data and our city's philosophy as the two key differences with regard to our real estate strategy versus anybody else's.
Okay, I think you also brought a video for us. What do you want to show us?
Yeah, so if we play that video, I can just sort of narrate over it. And actually, it's using Boston as an example. So one of the things we like about Boston is geographically what a sort of tight concentration it is in the city centre. It's well connected. You can see the key transport links here. But what we like about the clustering effect you get in Boston is this part of the city called Cambridge, and this is where you have some of the world's best universities. You can see MIT and Harvard. And then it's no accident that because of that expertise, that intellect in the city, this is the home for every pharmaceutical company, every venture capitalist trying to monetize drug discovery is located here in Boston. This is, as I mentioned earlier, the biotech capital of the world. And we have a company in our portfolio called Alexandria Real Estate who own assets, and you can see them highlighted just here in blue around Cambridge and in this part of Cambridge called Kendall Square. One of the new developments they are building today, it was announced about 2 weeks ago, is the new headquarters for Moderna. And so you can see that this company, Alexandria, is a great example of that thematic purity, playing to a world-class city, owning a niche subsector in the real estate market, which is life sciences, which are basically laboratories that, you and I would call them. And we really like that sort of an analysis that we're able to carry out, and that confidence that we have that Alexandria gives us that pure exposure to a leading city like Boston.
Okay, that's a lot of things coming together in real estate strategy.
And a lot of information. Sorry, too much perhaps.
That's fine. I think you made it quite clear. Thank you so much. Tom, stay with us. We're going to ask Ramon to come back with us, and we're going to put some poll questions before the audience. We have 4 polls. We're going to ask you and the audience what's true and what's going to happen. And after that, we can have a short discussion. Let's go to the first poll question. The energy transition is the most existential threat of our time. That's the question. Is the energy transition the most existential threat of our times? Now, while the people at home are filling in the poll, I would like to talk to you about it, but then maybe they will just answer what you are saying. No, they won't. They have their own mind. Ramon, if you would first respond to that one.
Probably yes, because it is a threat not only to us, maybe as Homo sapiens, but it is a threat also to our natural capital, which is a bit like our supply chain. Natural capital are aquatic ecosystems and oceans. It's land, food, forestry. And it's also very much related to what Tom is telling us, all the ecosystems around cities, around urban areas, right? So probably it is, which makes it ever more, it's a bit urgent, right? That us as Homo sapiens agree to tackle it in a very efficient manner.
Okay. I can tell you that people at home or at the office, I don't know where they are, 62% says yes, it is. 14%, 1/4 says no, it's overstated, and 21 is still in doubt. You want to convince them, Tom, or shall we go to the next poll? Those ones that are still in doubt.
I would agree with Ramon. I think it's so important in the focus that we're seeing at the moment, whether it's COP26, national governments, local governments, companies, tells us that this is steps we have to take. So yeah, I would be answering A.
Let's go to the next one. It's about nuclear energy. Should it play a key role in the future energy mix? We discussed it already before. Now let's ask the people at home. Should nuclear energy play a key role in the future energy mix? Please answer the poll question in your screen. Tom, I would like to start with you.
Yeah, fantastic. So I run a real estate fund investing in cities around the world, and whether nuclear should play a role in the energy mix is definitely out of my area of expertise. So I'm going to pass the ball to Ramon and stick purely to what I'm good at, which is real estate investing.
And maybe that's an advice of yours as well, to stick to your profession.
Absolutely.
And to your trade.
Know your limits, and this is it. So over to you, Ramon.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Already at a disadvantage because I love the video and I don't have anything to present. But anyway, well, I think we've spoken a bit before about nuclear and the fact that it has been very much politicized, right, and polarized opinions about nuclear. In our opinion, and although as a group we have certain restrictions to invest in nuclear if it doesn't respect international regulations, but in our opinion, we think that there is very interesting innovation, technological innovation in nuclear, in China, in the US, and as you can see, monies will be channeled towards that even in countries like France, here in Europe, because it is one of the sources of energy that pollutes less, that emits less greenhouse gases, and it can be one of the sources easiest to store and which has one of the highest energy density as a source of energy.
Ramon, can I ask you, because we did indeed talk about it already, but the main question, and I also see it here in the polls, is it safe? So let me first put before you what the people at home said. Altogether, 73% says yes, it should play a key role. 40% points of those say yes because it's safe and clean, but and 33% says there's another reason. So together they make up 73. But maybe most important, there's still 27% that says no because it's not safe. The risks of a disaster are too high. How is this changing? This is the old story around nuclear. Is this changing?
If you look, according to the World Nuclear Association, yes, you might say it's a biased opinion, but they have a lot of data. If you look at the amount of energy and hours of nuclear plants and the accidents that have been caused, the proportion is very, very feeble. It's very small. That doesn't mean, of course, that there are risks of accidents, and most of all, the way you manage waste is very important. Because that waste is difficult to manage, let's put it this way. But that doesn't mean that we should not innovate to try to, I don't know, solve these problems, but to try to reduce those problems around security and the management of waste. You know, we've had conversations with a professor at this École des Mines here in Paris, and he was saying that there's even natural nuclear waste that has been in the crust of the earth for many, many years and has had no implications to us Homo sapiens. So absolutely, yes, there are issues. 100% we agree, of course.
Okay.
We think it could be interesting to innovate because it's a very efficient source of energy.
Okay. Thank you so much. Let's go to the next poll question. The third goal of COP26 is to mobilize finance to accelerate the energy transition. For asset managers, the best way to do this is that A, disinvestment, B, engagement, or C, best of class selection. We've discussed it, engagement, disinvestment, or there's a third strategy, of course, the best of class selection. What would be the best way as investor to push this forward? People are already answering. Tom, what would you choose of those three?
Yeah, thanks for giving me a question that I can answer. So for me, the answer is definitely engagement. I mean, so I'm investing globally, and I'm talking, with companies one day in Japan, then maybe China or the UK, America. And the one thing that I know is that nobody knows the answer to how we're going to achieve these sort of net zero, sort of targets that we've set ourselves. Everybody is looking to try and do as much as they can. And so if we're able to share information, and we've done this with some of the data center companies we own in China and the US, and we're able to say, look, these US operators are best in class. These are the policies that they are doing. This is how much renewable power they're using. Running data centers in China or in Japan, wherever it is, you need to look at their policies, look to see whether you can mirror them, because you'll be able to make such a big impact. And the companies are so open-minded. They want to know what best in class looks like. And I think that engagement is really powerful, and we can make a difference whether we're investing in the companies or simply sharing information with companies who we're not investing in. I think engaging, to my mind, has to be the way forward, because every company that we speak to it understands how important it is, and that investors like us only want to invest in companies that are making a difference. And so I think engagement has to be the answer to it.
Well, I think Ramon just explained to us that he agrees as well. I have another question, though, because I think if you have a look at ABP, the pension fund in the Netherlands that disinvested and said, no more fossil for us, maybe that was not a rational economist decision. It was because of the people they were investing their money of. So their participants in the pension fund, they just didn't want it anymore. I mean, that's not what ABP said like that hard, but they kind of suggested it. So you can engage with the companies you invest in and try to convince them. But what about the investors? If they don't want to have to do anything to do with fossil anymore, then end of story.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to be very clear with your investors how you're going to invest and what you're going to do, and so that there shouldn't be any surprise. If I'm engaging with a company, my investors are very comfortable with me to do that. Similarly, if you have Ramon can comment on this, if you have an energy transition fund and your clients don't want you to have fossil fuel or whatever it is in there, then again, so long as you're transparent and clear with your investors, there should be no surprising. And so you won't find, in my opinion, you won't find yourself in this position where someone might say, why are you engaging with that company? We wouldn't expect you to do that. And that's certainly something we work very closely on.
Yeah. Ramon, how about you? I mean, of course, you can be transparent and explain to your clients, but what about clients that say, I don't want it?
This is an interesting question, because those clients, it could be that some of them say, I don't want it. They have an iPhone, they drive a car, they live in a building that maybe, as Tom says, doesn't use the most efficient technology to isolate. So it's a difficult question, right? Are you being 100% coherent? Because although we think it makes a lot of sense to invest in companies that offer environmental solution, we also think that now, with the technology we have, with the regulation, etc., we simply cannot avoid using fossil fuels. It is just impossible. Which means that it really depends. It's very difficult to be coherent in terms of investments and the way you decide. But of course, when you invest in a
is it your phone, Ramon?
There's a phone ringing here and I can't pick it up.
Maybe it's an investor who says, I don't agree now.
No, I don't think so.
If you can make sure it calms down and
yeah, just if I can stand up, I can.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Then I'm gonna tell you all what the people at home said about this. So 7% says disinvestment is the way to go about. So still 7%. 67, 2/3 say no, engagement is the way to go about, and 27% says best of class selection is the most important. Let's go to the last poll question for today. It's maybe a guess for some, or maybe an educated guess for others. By when will we be net zero? What do you think? We are net zero by 2030, 2050, 2060, or never. So when will we reach net zero? 2030, 2050, 2060, or never? People at home are answering the questions. What's your educated guess, Ramon?
I think it depends on Demographics, definitely, because that's very much linked to energy demand. It depends also on economic progress. You might also have countries that are developed and are increasing their energy consumption too. It doesn't have to be necessarily correlated only to GDP growth. Regulation, definitely. It depends on regulation. If we push with regulation to try to reduce that, what it's called the green premium, which is what you pay in excess, let's say if you want to use biofuel for your airplanes, what's the difference in price from using this biofuel from traditional kerosene, for example? And it also depends on technology, of course. If a technological advancement, I've read this book by Bill Gates, it's very interesting, called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. It's very well written. And he explains how if you are able, he's very optimistic with technology, if we are able to develop that technology rapidly.
Ramon, I'm afraid we don't have time to go into the book, but I kind of feel you say there's so much involved here, you don't really know when we'll get there. So let's stay hopeful. Tom, what would be your wild guess? Or educated guess?
I'm going for 2050, and just as Ramon is talking about, I'm optimistic for technology enabling us to reach that sort of faster than we expect. So that's what I believe.
Well, thank you guys so much. Tom Walker from Schroders en Ramon Estruelas van BNP Paribas. En ik ga terug naar Nederlands en terug naar u thuis. Dank je wel voor het kijken. Ik maak graag nog even gebruik van de gelegenheid om u te wijzen op het volgende event. En dat is het Outlook Event 2021. En dat vindt live plaats in Amsterdam op 25 november. Daar bent u dus van harte welkom. Bent u een professionele belegger en wilt u weten wat u te wachten staat in 2022... dan moet u daar echt aanwezig zijn. Er zijn nog een paar kaarten beschikbaar, dus ben er snel bij. Voor podcastartikelen en alles wat u wilt weten over de energietransitie... natuurlijk kunt u naar www.fondsnieuws.nl/thematisch. Tot de volgende keer.